planning and protected areas in
This meeting is being recorded.
Eastern and Southern Africa. Special thanks to our presenters today, Dr. Nyambe Nyambe and Professor Udson Gandiwa, for taking the time to join us and share their experience. As Melanie said, my name is Angela Hogg, and I'm the Acting Deputy Mission Director for USAID Southern Africa, based in Pretoria. Today's webinar focuses on the concept of collaborative conservation, that by enhancing collaboration across landscapes and through partners, we can improve environmental outcomes. Not a new concept, but one that is very relevant to the challenges facing the Kavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area. As a regional USAID mission, we have a comparative advantage to work on development issues and challenges like biodiversity conservation and water resource management through a regional lens and not be constrained by country borders. We are also able to mainstream climate change adaptation into regional policies and plans, for example, in river basin management strategies, to build resilience and reduce vulnerability at a larger scale. This is important now more than ever, with climate impacts intensifying around the region and the globe. All of USAID's work is grounded on the context of a changing climate. Engaging at a regional level allows us to quickly scale up and achieve our ambitious climate targets. One of our key roles is supporting regional entities who work in the transboundary context. We have for many years worked closely with the Southern African Development Community and their different technical units, as well as with a number of the river basin organizations around the region, and also with transfrontier conservation areas. CASA is one of USAID's closest partners in the region, with many of our activities partnering with CASA in one way or another. For example, our Combating Wildlife Crime portfolio spans 8 countries and targets 4 priority landscapes, one of which is CASA. And in this particular case, we partner with a consortium of 13 other organizations spread out across the Namibia and CASA landscapes, creating a high-functioning cross-border network of civil society organizations working on wildlife crime-related issues. This collaboration is vital to our success, combating illegal wildlife crime across the region. To reinforce some of this work in which we mitigate threats to biodiversity, USAID is supporting the implementation of a standardized wildlife monitoring system into the Okavango Delta. The first step has taken place in the partnership with the Botswana Department of Wildlife and National Parks, with the ultimate plan to roll out the system at a transboundary level across the CASA Transfrontier Conservation Area. USAID has also partnered with CASA to update management plans for Chobe National Park and Moremi Game Reserve to ensure climate adaptation is a key focus area in managing the CASA landscape. We also collaborated with CASA to develop an inclusive CASA livelihoods diversification strategy to protect and restore natural resources and empower people to access a wide range of livelihood choices. The strategy, when completed, will promote resilient livelihoods for more than 2 million people who live in the CASA TFCA. USAID greatly values our partnership with CASA and all of our regional conservation partners. The scale and scope of the climate crisis demands that we foster greater collaboration and continue to deepen these engagements in order to advance our shared development objectives. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to join you today. I'm really excited to learn more from our speakers on how the US context and the opportunities and challenges in transboundary conservation applies to the CASA landscape. And I hope that you all can be active participants in today's discussion. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Melanie. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us and for that fantastic introduction. And there are a lot of people here today, and welcome everybody. We don't have time, of course, to verbally introduce everyone, but it is fun to see the chats. And so if you would, please introduce yourself in the chat now by typing your name, position, title, organization, and the country you're joining us from today. We can all say hi, and I will start that by dropping in my information right there. Okay, just one second here. Okay, so the other way that we can get to know each other a little bit and see who's on the call today is I'm going to share just a couple of brief poll questions for you. So if you could sit up a little straighter and grab your mouse, I'm going to ask the first question here. And that is, what's the best description of your organization relative to the management of protected areas or landscapes? And we have a few options: a protected area of some kind, a non-US provincial district or federal agency, academia, nonprofit, other stakeholder organization, US government, and student. And the answers are rolling in. I will give it just a few more seconds. And welcome to everybody who's dropping their information in the chat. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll and share with everyone. Hopefully you can see these responses. We've got a good number from nonprofit organizations, other stakeholder organizations. So I'm curious to find out who those are. A good amount from the US government, of course. Okay, thank you for that one. And then one more, which is learning desires about this series. So we really want to make this useful to you. Most important thing I'd like to learn about in this series is to learn about what other organizations are doing, discover tools I can implement now, identify potential new partnerships, fill gaps in my organization's knowledge, how to prioritize my next action. Thank you for putting that in. I know it's hard to choose just one. They really are interlinked. Okay, I'm going to end this poll and share. Ooh. All right, so it's pretty good spread, but learning what organizations are doing and identifying potential new partnerships are definitely priorities of this series for us. And I'm going to go ahead and drop a link to the webinars we've done so far. So we've had 5 webinars up until this point. They really focus largely on tools and resources for climate change adaptation planning in the US and in different parts of Africa. And so if you click on that link, you can go see those webinar recordings and what they're about, who we featured. And I really hope that they can be useful to you or folks that you know. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that poll. Thank you for participating in those exercises. I look forward to continuing to hear your responses in the chat and by unmuting yourselves and speaking with us. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Joel to introduce our presenters.
Wonderful. Thank you, Melanie. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for sharing some information about yourself so we have a sense of who all's here. As Melanie just reminded everybody, just please mute yourself if you're not speaking, and be sure to ask questions and share comments in the chat as the presentations begin. So today we have a slightly different structure than we've used in the past. So we're going to have one presentation from Dr. Amanda Sesser, who I'll introduce in a minute, followed by a panel discussion with Dr. Sesser, Dr. Nyambe, and Dr. Godwin. So to kick it off, we have Dr. Amanda Sesser, who's the coordinator of the Southeast Conservation and Adaptation Strategy Partnership in the Southeast of the United States, otherwise known as CCAS. CCAS brings together public and private organizations around a bold vision for the future of their region, which is connecting the lands and waters of the Southeast US and Caribbean to support healthy ecosystems, thriving fish and wildlife populations, and vibrant communities. With a data-driven spatial plan and an ambitious regional goal, CCAS helps accelerate conservation action in the places where it will make the biggest impact. Amanda specializes in involving stakeholders, decision makers, and scientists in processes to solve climate change challenges and large-scale conservation planning and design, as well as scientific translation and communication to policymakers. And with that, I will pass it over to Amanda.
Thanks so much, Joel and Melanie, for the great introduction. Can everyone hear me okay?
Coming through clear.
Perfect. Okay, well, I'm going to present, as Joel mentioned, on transboundary collaborative conservation, and I'm focusing mostly on my experience in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere. And I'm interested to see how some of the work that we do here in the West is similar and can be of service to the work that you all are doing in your local regions. I'm going to go pretty quick through this because we're trying to save enough time for the panel discussion. So if there's something that you want me to spend a little bit more time on or come back to, I'm more than happy to expand or give more information. But first, I just wanted to just remind us, why do we want to do transboundary collaborative conservation? And really, you know, the natural resources that we're protecting, they don't stop at our political borders. You know, wildlife doesn't go up to the border of a park and say, oh, I'm going to stop here because this is the park boundary. No, they just roam and go wherever their habitat is and wherever the food and shelter and water are. So it's important for us to work beyond our individual boundaries. And also, one of the key pieces is that within our own organizations, we have our certain mandates and tools and impact that we can provide from our organization. But when you combine multiple organizations together, we can achieve more than we can individually. There's certain challenges like climate change that are so big that you need to partner with as many organizations as you can. Individually, we can't make that much of a difference, but together we really can. And so how do you do this? This is something we could spend an hour on, just this piece of how you do transboundary collaborative conservation. But it always starts with bringing together stakeholders. And that is comprised of people that you would talk to on a daily basis from other partners and agencies that you work closely with, but it's also people that you don't work that closely with that maybe aren't traditional partners. So thinking outside of our typical relationships and thinking about who is dealing with the same kind of challenges that we are. And it also means involving people who are impacted by land use change, by climate change, by the types of conservation challenges, drought, and other things that we're seeing, so that the people who are being impacted themselves also have a voice and a responsibility to come up with solutions. It's always great to start by looking at what we have in common, and nothing brings together a group of diverse people together better than a common enemy, whether that's climate change, whether that's drought or poaching or whatever the challenge is. If we share that challenge in common, it can bring a group together very quickly. And then, of course, then we have to look at ways that we can collaborate and work together. And one thing that we often do in transboundary conservation is think about where are the things that we're already doing that are in common, and doing them in a more coordinated, more informed way. But this last point is really important. We don't want to stop with what we already do and just do it better. We want to go beyond that. We want to say we have so much more potential and capacity to make a difference across large areas if we work together. So thinking big, thinking bold, and having ambitious targets. One group that I've worked with for the last 5 years is the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research. We call it the IAI for short. And this is an intergovernmental organization that is focusing just on the Americas. And there are 19 parties or member countries that span from Canada to Chile. And it really is a venue for the 19 countries to come together to think about what we can do continental-wide, transcontinental-wide, that can really make a difference, especially when it comes to global change. The IAI framework has 3 pillars. One is collaborative governance and policy, and this is to help the individual countries align their Paris Agreement responsibilities and think about how we can create policies that are inclusive and thinking about climate adaptation, but how can we learn from one another, and how can we take information that one country is doing and say, oh, well, that makes a lot of sense for my country. The second pillar is the science program. And the IEI really focuses on transdisciplinary science or co-production of knowledge. And this type of science involves multiple disciplines, natural sciences, physical sciences, but also social sciences, engineering, psychology, and it even goes beyond the sciences to involve people, stakeholders, indigenous groups, people who are impacted, women and children, into the scientific research process itself to better ensure that the science products are being used by the decision makers and the policy makers. And then this third piece is something that I feel would resonate with a lot of you on the call this morning, is the idea of capacity building and how to build up science capacity and global change adaptation capacity within individual governments. And this takes multiple forms from having fellowship programs to capacity building grants and workshops. But the idea is, and even grant writing, how to be competitive with some of the larger countries in grants, really trying to give the countries of the Americas the ability to stand on their own with full-fledged global change research programs and not relying on other countries, as is often the case with the smaller countries in the Americas. And this IAI has a strategic plan that helps guide their efforts. The strategic plan is 25 years long. So it goes 25 years into the future. Why would you think about it that far in advance for a strategic plan? Well, the reason why is when you're thinking about global change, a lot of what we do is forward-looking. We have to be proactive and think about adapting to changes that haven't even occurred yet, but that we're relatively certain will occur. And also, the impact of our actions today oftentimes is not measurable until many years in the future. So we can measure intermediate results in the meantime, but the long-term or the fundamental outcome or the real reason why we're doing the work sometimes cannot be seen for quite a while. In this 25-year strategic plan, we have 3 themes. One is meeting the needs of the parties to address global environmental change problems. This is really driven by the countries themselves and helping them do what they already need to do, but in a better and more informed way. The second is the science for the sustainability of the Americas, and this is what formulates the backbone of the IEI's research program. And then lastly is the sustainability of the IEI, the organization itself. How does the organization remain relevant and maintain funding and the resources necessary to keep moving on in the future? I'm going to very quickly, there's a lot of words on this slide. I'm going to very quickly just highlight the words at the beginning in bold. The science for the sustainability of the Americas. In order for the Americas to be sustainable, the IEI feels like it must address poverty and inequality, food security, water security, energy security, as well as climate action, human health and well-being, biodiversity and ecosystem services, and clean air, water, and soil. This last one also includes plastic pollution. So these are large themes. Obviously, one organization can't do everything for every one of these 8 goals, but thinking long-term about this organization 25, 50, 75 years in the future, we want to be able to say that we have addressed as many of these as possible and have not just done the research around these themes, but made a difference, a measurable difference on the ground. Next is the sustainability of the IEI. This is the funding structure and has to do with the long-term viability of this organization. It has an intergovernmental organization funding model. So the 19 parties or the 19 countries who are part of the IEI have signed a treaty. So this is parliament or congressional level treaty that states that each country will provide a certain percentage of their GDP towards this organization. That keeps the lights on in the offices and keeps a small secretariat or a small staff employed. It covers things like travel and salaries, but it doesn't cover the science funding and the research program. So they have to do fundraising and work with partners to make sure that they have funding for the other work, the capacity building and the science programs. So this part of the strategic plan deals a lot with communications and visibility. It also deals with fundraising and diversification of funds. And the United States National Science Foundation has been the primary funder for the last 25 years, last 30 years for the IAI research program. And in fact, it's been the sole funder for the research branch of the IAI. And that's now changing with the National Science Foundation saying, you know, we can no longer be the sole funder. We can provide a little bit, but you need to find other sources of funding. And so there's a need now to diversify funding sources. So the IAI Secretariat is looking at where are these other opportunities outside the region. And one potential source of funding is through the United Nations South-South cooperation, something that you might be familiar with. It links up work that's being done in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, you know, around the global South. Also, ICLEI, which is Local Governments for Sustainability, is funding projects with Sao Paulo and Argentina and with Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, and Santiago, Chile, among others, to think about how the cities themselves can be more sustainable. And then European countries are stepping in and saying that that they would like to fund some of the work that the IAI is doing. And so it's opening up a new world of potential funding that's outside of the region, that's outside of the Americas. One big component of attracting funders is linking the actions of the organization to on-the-ground conservation outcomes. Most donors and funders, they don't care about the research mechanisms and the collaborative research networks and so forth. They want to know, are there areas that have been conserved? Are there resources that are better now than they were at the beginning? Are there people that have better livelihoods now than they did at the beginning? And so this linking action to outcome is huge in the international funding scene. And lastly, I want to mention the Belmont Forum specifically as a funding model that's emerging in the Americas. It's a flexible funding mechanism that involves multiple countries in the Americas, and I believe it's even bigger than just the Americas. But each country provides a certain amount of funding towards a shared priority, where the entire forum comes together and decides what is the most important thing right now that we need to work on. This year's call for proposals is about climate change and human migration. Where are people moving from and to? How are they doing it? What are the challenges? What are the social, economic, and environmental costs of mass migration due to climate change? This was a priority for a lot of the countries, and they said this is something that we need to get ahead of and understand better because it's happening and it will only increase in the future. So they put out the call for proposals, and the way that the Belmont Forum works is that each country puts into the larger pot of funding, so to say, where so all the countries are contributing, and then people who are writing the proposals to get the funding, they must have either 3 or 4 countries. It depends on the call, but it's a minimum of 3 countries working together on the same project. And then that country's contribution pays for that country's researchers. So if Argentina and Brazil and Chile are all working together on a project, then the Brazilian funds go to fund the Brazilian researchers and the Argentinian funds go to fund the Argentine researchers. By partnering with the IAI, the II is now contributing funding to the Belmont Forum on behalf of the 19 partners, the 19 countries that are signatories to the IAI. And this is allowing a lot of smaller countries, Bolivia, Guatemala, Peru, a lot of countries that have not had the capacity to be part of these larger funding opportunities. Now they can contribute because the IAI will pay for their research. And it's opening a new world for a lot of smaller countries and underfunded research programs. Now I'm going to switch completely to the work that I do currently in the US. As Jill mentioned, I'm the coordinator of the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, and it is a partnership of 15 states and 2 territories in the southeastern United States, shown here by this map. So we're only focusing within the United States, but it's a big chunk. It's a lot of area inside of in the US, with the southern US and the Caribbean. There are over 30 organizations that are part of this partnership. They are federal, state, tribal, NGO, and but the funding comes 100% through the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. And this is an interesting funding model because in the past, other partnerships that have been similar to this, also hosted by the Fish and Wildlife Service, tried to get other partners to help fund, right? That's the thing is with transboundary conservation is who's going to pay for it. So there's an interest to have other partners chip in. Well, in this case with CICUS, the Fish and Wildlife Service says, let's not worry about that. Let's just get work done. Let's focus more on the implementation and less on who's going to fund the staff and provide the building space and so forth. And so it takes the pressure away from the funding and puts more impetus on the ground action as a model. The vision is a connected network of lands and waters. And we have goals and actually on the ground metrics that we can measure to see the improvement of the health function connectivity of our southeastern landscapes by 2060. Here are some of the metrics. And I know I'm going pretty fast, but I want to make sure we save time for the panel. We also have a fairly sophisticated a resource map showing where are the priority areas for doing conservation that will have the most impact on health function and connectivity of our systems. So the challenges and opportunities I wanted to just visit, and I think this will take us into the panel discussion. But some of the challenges include for doing this kind of work, the large scale, multi-partner, thinking outside of our boundaries. It can be hard. And one thing that helps is having a bridging organization or some type of organization that's an umbrella over the partnership that has full-time coordination, that has people who are thinking and coordinating and getting the people in the room and doing the work that has to be done in between the meetings. Because we all know that in our daily jobs, we're so busy that doing something extra is a lot. It's a lot to ask. So a bridging organization can be really important. Another challenge is, well, who's going to pay for it? Who's providing the funding? That's like the persistent challenge in any kind of work that we do, but especially transboundary work. It's also tough to get engagement and follow through in this type of work. Like you might have one person who comes to the table from a particular agency who's really excited and gung-ho, and then they go back to their own agency after the meeting, and their colleagues are like, well, so what? Why should we do this? Why should we get excited? It's difficult to inspire and motivate an entire agency when you're only dealing with particular individuals from that organization. And then there's also the turnover, and we all know this. You're working with somebody, you have great relationships, things are going really well, and then they retire or they take another position and someone else comes in who does not share the same enthusiasm or the same interest as the person before. We're also often limited in our technical expertise, and a lot of times this is spatial. and thinking about the work that we're doing in the future, there are certain skill sets that are really important to have. And then, as we all know, time and capacity is just, we're all so busy that having the ability to do transboundary work on top of the work that we're already doing within our boundaries is always a challenge. But I want to end on the opportunities. So why would we want, what's the motivation for going the extra mile, for putting in the extra work to do transboundary work? It helps each of us meet our international targets. So we're all on the hook for those of us who are in countries who have signed the Paris Agreement and are parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity and other multilateral agreements. Working cross-boundary, working with in these large-scale partnerships can help us meet those targets and help us with the reporting and help us with the technical capacity to think about 30 by 30, the Sustainable Development Goals, et cetera. There's also more and more diverse international funding models that are emerging that can help us do this work by providing that funding and extra capacity. And then it's also important to realize that when you're working transboundary with multiple organizations, one organization is not responsible for doing the entire thing, just responsible for one little piece. And most likely it's the piece that you're already doing anyway, that you already have the expertise, you already have the capacity, you already have the mandates, but doing it in a way that scales up. So in a large landscape, you have one organization doing this, one organization doing this, one organization doing this, and it adds up to large scale conservation impacts. It needs to be coordinated. So it's not just the work that we're already doing individually, but when we can coordinate it, we can really do a lot more than we can individually. And then the risk is distributed. So if something doesn't go right, it's not just one organization's fault, or we can say we can experiment and do something new that we don't know for sure if it's going to work, but we can share that risk and do it together. A lot of what we think about in climate adaptation fits within that box, because we oftentimes have to take risk and have to do things differently than what we've traditionally done. And then the last plus for working in large landscapes is building trusting relationships. And I don't think I have to go into that in too much detail, because we all know the importance of building trust and building relationships and working together in the long term. And with that, I don't know if we have time for questions, Joel and Melanie, or if we want to go right into the panel discussion, but I'm happy to address any questions.
So if people, this is Joel. Thank you very much, Amanda. That was wonderful. If you have an immediate, very targeted question for Amanda, please go ahead and either unmute yourself and ask that question, or put it in the chat, or raise your hand and I'll call on you. But know that we're about to go into a panel, so the more general questions, I'd like to save those for the panel discussion. But if there's a point of clarification or anything like that, please go ahead and ask. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the rest of our speakers today, and we'll move into the panel discussion. Right, so Amanda will be joined by Dr. Nyambe Nyambe, who's the Executive Director of the CASA Secretariat, a position he's held since 2018. His background: in the mid-1990s, he worked as a wetlands officer and later as a community well-being specialist under the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in Barotse floodplains, Zambia. He subsequently held the following positions. He's been Program Director for the Environment and Development Program and the Center for Environment and Development at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and Project Executive at the Zambezi Chobe Fishery Project with the Namibia Nature Foundation. From 2008 to 2017, he worked for WWF Zambia in different capacities as a wetlands officer, project coordinator, conservation manager, and subsequently as country director. He holds a Bachelor of Social Work from the University of Zambia, a Master's of Environment and Development from the University of Natal, and a PhD from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He will be joined by Professor Edson Gandawa, Director of Scientific Services, Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority. Dr. Gandawa has 18 years of experience in the field of wildlife conservation. He's contributed to several projects at national, regional, and international levels, including the development of protected area management plans, the Zimbabwe Tourism Master Plan, the Communal Areas Management Program for Indigenous Resources, or Campfire Review. He's been involved in aerial surveys of large mammals, regional biodiversity and ecosystem services assessment for Africa, and sustainable use of wild species assessment under the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES. He's co-authored over 150 peer-reviewed scientific publications and holds a PhD in wildlife conservation and management from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. So Dr. Nambe and Dr. Gandawa, if you would go ahead and turn on your cameras, and Amanda, if you turn on your cameras, and then let's see, I've got, so as Melanie mentioned at the beginning, we have a couple questions to kick this off that we've shared with presenters. So we'll rotate through asking those questions, but as we're doing this, I would encourage people to be raising questions and items of interest in the chat so that we ultimately just evolve into an open discussion. So the first is really just asking Drs. Nyambe and Gandawa to briefly describe their current roles or programs and responsibilities. So, and if you let me know, I do have a map if you would like me to show that.
Yes, Joe, you may go ahead and show the map.
Okay.
And as you're doing that, thank you very much for having us. Quite a lot of parallels from what Amanda was talking about, just listening to that. And I think in terms of your question, I would say that the CASA Secretariat, which is located in Kasane, Botswana, is what Amanda basically referred to as a bridging organization, basically a facilitation and coordination hub. And what is very critical here really is that the CASA Secretariat is one of the several structures established in line with the CASA Treaty, which was signed in 2011. And our work as a Secretariat involves day-to-day management of all affairs related to the development of the CASA TFCA, connecting and working with various stakeholders and partners, as well as supporting the implementation of strategic priorities and intentions of the CASA partner states in line with the CASA vision and mission. What you have here is a very, I hope you can see it, a map of CASA. Just to provide a context, there is about 18 transfrontier conservation areas in Southern Africa Development Community, and CASA is the largest. It's right in the middle of that map on your left. And I think just to give a context for you colleagues, since most of you are from the US, CASA is 520,000 square kilometers, approximately the size of the state of California or Texas. And it is bigger than all the 17. One of the TFCAs in the SADC region is a marine transfrontier conservation area. So if we exclude that, and you look at just the terrestrial transfrontier conservation areas, CASA is bigger than all the other 17 combined by at least 6 times the size of Yellowstone National Park. I hope that just gives you a context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's a very helpful context, especially realizing the geographic scale of that region. Dr. Gandawa, would you like to briefly introduce your programs and responsibilities?
Thank you very much. And also thank you very much for the kind introduction. So for me, I represent the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority, and my division is scientific services. So the structure that we have in Zimbabwe is that the government is a ministry responsible for environment. That is the Ministry of Environment, Climate, Tourism, and Hospitality Industry. And under that ministry, we have
I saw a post on the American Embassy page. So I registered.
Sorry for that. So the ZIMPAX is an agency which is the mandate of wildlife management in Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe being a partner state to CASA, as has been alluded to by Dr. Nyambe. Basically, ZIMPAX plays the key role in coordinating and leading all the activities that are happening for CASA, that is for Zimbabwe. And more importantly, Zimbabwe being one of the key range states in terms of biodiversity, our ministry then, and ZIMPAX in particular, do make sure that all the key programming with CASA are implemented, and we do that, play that role as ZIMPAX. I would, for now, stop there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for that background. And to you, Melanie.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would like to kick off a few questions that we have prepared here. And I see that Larry Sperling has also posted a question in the comment, which is really great. And we would like to turn some of these questions over to our audience as well. But starting specifically with Drs. Gandiwa and Nyambe, can you talk about what your goals are most focused on in the short term, in the next 1 to 2 years? What opportunities do you hope to take advantage of, and what challenges present themselves for that, and what ideas do you have for overcoming them?
Yeah, if I may go first, Melanie. So today is a very happy day for us in the CASA partner states, in collaboration with a number of donors, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Now, you may be aware that the first ever CASA-wide aerial survey of elephants is underway. And I think that is a major development, because CASA is home to about 50% of the African elephant population, which is contiguous, and there's need for us to leverage science and technology to give us an understanding of the status in terms of population distribution, and also in terms of the carcasses as far as illegal killings might be concerned. So that is one of the major issues that we have to work on. Second issue relates to basically understanding and supporting the communities that live side by side with wildlife. Now, elephants are just but one of the species. It's very important to appreciate the fact that there is a lot of interaction that happens between the community members and the wildlife. One thing I neglected to mention in my earlier remarks was that we're talking about 20 national parks, including Hwange, Luenge Luyana in Angola, the Kafue National Park, and other national parks, and about 85 forest reserves. Now, these areas are very important for the movement of the different wildlife species, which include carnivores. So it's very, very important that we find a way of balancing the requirements of the communities that live side by side with the wildlife, and also protection of the wildlife in the wild areas. Another point that is worth emphasizing is that tourism is at the heart of the CASA processes, and also in the vision. So how do we promote and facilitate transboundary tourism? And lastly, but not the least, it's very important that I say this, and I'll come back to this point later. CASA is quite vulnerable to the impacts and effects of climate change. It's very important that we leverage science to prepare for what is obviously unknown, but very likely pointing in the direction of very difficult times ahead for both biodiversity and people. And of course, economy is linked to these partner states. Let me pause here for now.
Thank you, Melanie. I will come in just to value add from what Dr. Nyambe has already given. So in addition to the factors laid the issue of human-wildlife coexistence is one of the key aspects. I think Southern Africa, particularly Khaza, having that high biodiversity, and also the huge elephant, population. It is, very critical that we also ensure that the human, wildlife coexistence is much more, sustainable as we move, forward. The issue of community, livelihoods, I'm happy that this has already been talked even earlier. We need to improve the rural, development and wildlife economy in this regard, particularly is one key aspect that is very critical as a long-term goal. And lastly, in terms of goals, I would put that we, as SADC or the Southern African Development Committee community, there is the need to, collaboratively manage the shared resource. Because this is something which we are endowed with, there is need then to be able to ensure that we have sustainability in managing that shared resource. As the map that was presented by Dr. Nyambe, you would see that, animals, as also was earlier presented, they know no political boundaries. So it's very, very critical that we are able to do this collaboratively. Then I will just move on to two challenges. Beyond climate change has already been given. I think the other aspect is the issue of competing claims on natural resources. This is becoming very much critical, given that even if we look at climate change, the reliance, over-reliance on natural resources is very, very key, given that this is one of the main aspects that we have is endowed in those countries. And then I think the second that I will give is the issue of funding. Conservation by itself demands a lot of resources, and we do feel that moving ahead, and also in looking into the future, there is need to have a sustainable funding mechanism to ensure that the biodiversity we are dealing with, and even the monitoring, as has been given, that aerial survey, this is the first coordinated aerial survey within the Khaza states. If we are able to do that periodically, it will help us to come up with clear adaptive management frameworks as we take into effect the issues of climate change, issues of other pressures that we are facing in terms of managing biodiversity. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm curious, what kinds of funding and partnerships do you hope to pursue that you haven't already obtained in order to address these, to ensure a balance between wildlife and human interaction, especially in the context of climate change? Are there ideas on the horizon that you have yet to pursue that are at the front of your minds?
Let me come in first on that, Melanie, and just to say that it's very important that you are raising that question. And yes, for quite some time, Khaza has been established and developed as a long-term engagement. So the treaty that was signed way back in 2011, is really a very long commitment by the partner states. So part of the funding to keep the secretariat running comes from the partner states through their annual contributions. But we've received significant support, particularly for the establishment period from the German government, which is nearing 50 million euros since about 2011. And we're currently implementing the third phase of that support, which addresses issues of human-wildlife conflict, livelihoods, infrastructure, tourism development, and natural resources management. Then it's very important to say that this funding from the German government has been part of the seed funding for the development and establishment and development of Khaza. Significant funding has started coming in, and I think Amanda made the mention of donor diversification earlier, and we begin to see that from the US government. Just to give an example, we've received support from US Fish and Wildlife towards one of the major problems that we face in terms of combating wildlife crime through the Vukanau project and the Combating Wildlife Crimes project, which Angela mentioned earlier. We've received funding from the Resilient Waters program, and which is funded via USAID, which has gone to directly to some of our partners and also through limited scope agreements with the Secretariat targeted to addressing specific issues related to water resources management, capacity building, and addressing issues of water sanitation and health education. From the Department of State in the US, we've received funding also that has gone towards promoting transboundary governance of shared water resources. We've received funding also from the Postcode Dutch Lottery, going towards the aerial surveys, which has gone towards the protection of wildlife keystone species and also community livelihoods. And I think it's also very, very important that we appreciate the role that the governments themselves are doing insofar as supporting the various sectors within their respective CASA components and support to transboundary initiatives such as joint law enforcement work that is going on across the landscape. Lastly, but not the least, and I'm just speaking from the top of my head here, we've seen an increase in the level of support that has come from, the European Union through different organizations such as the CITES MIC and also through the UN environment. These are just some of the initiatives of the growing support that we're receiving. But given the scale of CASA that I mentioned in my opening remarks, there is still a lot of resources required to address the various priorities. Thank you.
Yeah, that's, go ahead, Joel.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh,
So
yes, Ed, yes.
Just to complement Dr. Nyambe in terms of at the partner state level, so as Zimbabwe, we have been as part of ZIMPACT and also the government, we have been collaboratively working with the key stakeholders and also our major international funding agencies. We have benefited first from the CASA Secretariat in terms of project funding that deals with the biodiversity actions and also community projects. And this is something that we are very much happy that framework, the CASA Secretariat has been able to have that collaboration and also the funding being able to come through to partner states. Then as partner our states, Zimbabwe, we have also been able to get funding from World Bank, which has been able to run some projects as part of the biodiversity landscape planning for Wange Sanyati. We also have been able to get some collaborative arrangement in terms of managing our protected area, for instance, from IFO, in terms of running some co-management projects within the park. I think as we move forward, we are now trying to explore potential funding from the climate financing to do with carbon credits and the like. So that's one area where we are keen to be able to explore, to make sure that we also supplement the funding that is coming through the CASA Secretariat, but also the funding that is coming from the government and also particularly as impacts. So these are some of the key aspects, but we do feel that there is still a room to collaborate with other partners and our organizations in terms of biodiversity, our funding, particularly dealing with the interface of the park and the community. That's something which is very, very important. Just to mention that in Zimbabwe, the Campfire program, which I'm sure many of the participants here are aware of, is one avenue which has been able to also bring some money to support community conservation and also community development. And we do feel with the Campfire program being renovated in terms of ensuring that it's reinvented in terms of the model itself to bring more value to community benefits, we'll be able to also get funding from organizations that support community development as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. It's a really wonderful diversification of funding sources and very interesting to learn about the various groups that are working with you. We have some great questions coming in on the chat that I want to get to, but first I want to ask Amanda, you spoke about these robust partnerships across Latin America from your work with IAI and the importance of diversification of funding. Are there parallel challenges to what Edson and Nyambe are talking about that you experienced in Latin America related to that struggle to balance human-wildlife interactions and use of resources, or particularly anticipating challenges of climate change that you want to comment on?
Yeah, I think as Dr. Gandiwa mentioned earlier, it's very similar, the parallels between the work that we do in the West and the work that you're doing here in Africa. And so it's great to be able to talk about it like this and share information and learn from each other. It's absolutely the case in Latin America and the Caribbean, where it's for instance, there's the majority of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are developing. They want to be able to access natural resources. They want to be able to build the economy and have the resources and the social capital, the GDP that other countries have in the Northern Hemisphere, for instance. And that's one of the things that we need to support in these partnerships is we have to provide economic development opportunity in order to minimize some of these conflicts, like what we're talking about. So that when you're working across large areas, like what you are here in your area, it's important to think about where across these areas should resource extraction happen, should urbanization and building infrastructure happen, where should wildlife conservation take place, and thinking about the connectivity across these areas to make sure that we're not fragmenting the landscape for wildlife and other resources to move across the continent, really. So that level of forward thinking and planning is really important. But the same challenges exist in Latin America as well, where convincing people that this is really important and that there's value in protecting our wildlife resources, protecting our natural resources in general. And in the Amazon rainforest basin, for instance, there's a lot of interest in pharmaceutical drugs and looking at the diversity in plant and animal life, as well as microbial life, to discover new chemical compounds that could cure cancer or other human diseases. And how do you protect the sovereignty of that? The ecological property, is something that we deal with. That's in addition to wildlife trade. We also think about like ecological property as property of the local people and of that sovereign nation, and how to address the conflict of pharmaceutical companies or from larger countries coming in and trying to harvest that too. So there's several parallels. There's a lot of differences, but the nuances are very similar among the two regions.
Okay, thank you so much, Amanda. We're going to keep exploring this topic. Some interesting parallels across the different ecosystems. We're talking about the rainforest and then the Kaza system. And so speaking of providing economic opportunity to communities to ensure that balance, I have a question from Patty who asks, and Patty, you can unmute yourself too if you'd like to ask this, but I'll go ahead and read what you typed here. And that was, this is a question for everyone. National parks are often seen as islands of plenty in an ocean of poverty. And with climate change, this will get worse. How do you communicate the need for conservation to hungry communities and mobilize protected area benefits to those communities?
Thank you, Melanie. And I'm not sure who raised that question, but just say it's a very important and valid question. Here in the Kaza partner states, one of the key issues that we've talked about is that of ensuring that there is stewardship, a community stewardship, and that's the only way you can ensure that there is buy-in from communities. So Professor Gandiwa gave the example of the campfire, but it's not the only one. You have the Namibian Conservancy Program. Now these initiatives, or in Botswana, the Conservation Trust, in Zambia, the Community Resource Boards, these initiatives are anchored on the idea of community-based natural resource management, building systems for benefits and access, and also sharing, This is in line with the CBD Convention. It's also initiatives that ensure that communities have a say in what is happening. So protected areas are really not supposed to be seen as an island, and sometimes they are seen like that, but we really need to look at them as one of our barometers of sustainability and commitment to biodiversity conservation. They play a critical role, but they should not be demonized. What alternatives do we have if we don't have protected areas? It's very important to know the map that I showed on CASA earlier. We're talking about connectivity across the landscape, and these the wildlife in the protected areas and communal areas, moves around also at a transboundary scale. We are talking about a mosaic of land uses as opposed to just protected areas. Protected areas are part of the social ecological interaction that we're promoting as an idea of promoting coexistence and stewardship that also brings in communities into the process. Thank you.
Yeah, Melanie, if I could just add to that, I think that Dr. Nyambe is spot on with that, where we need to, and especially in a climate change context, not think about protected areas as islands, but start to think about them as important pieces in a connected landscape. So the matrix in between those protected areas needs to be prioritized through our social processes, whether it's making more protected areas, but maybe that's not even feasible politically or financially or however. So how do you get the local communities engaged and see the importance of the areas that are connecting these protected areas, especially given climate change, as we expect plants and animals to migrate and track their climate niches. As the climate changes, the communities, the natural communities are going to be on the move. And we need them to be able to move from one park to the next. They're not going to stay stationary in that particular park, so that the connectivity of that whole landscape becomes really critical. And another thing that Dr. Nyambe mentioned that I wanted to underscore is that the co-stewardship idea, that empowering communities to be part of the solution and to see their importance is really critical in order to implement that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Amanda. I really appreciate that the complexity of the environment that you're working in, that you continue to bring in the concept that climate change will multiply the threats and the challenges that you face, but also that you have this incredible connectivity of partnerships and opportunities that will also potentially put you in a good position in order to respond to those challenges as they come forward. We are getting great questions coming in the chat. We're just going to throw out the questions we prepared before. And Joel, do you want to ask the next question, or should I?
Sure, I'll jump in. And so again, people keep submitting questions in chat. We're sort of trying to organize them as we go for a little bit of a sequence as the conversations are happening. And thank you, Alex, for raising your hand. We'll get to you in just a minute. And so we have two questions that I'm going to combine that has a little bit to do with history and environmental policy frameworks. And so I'm going to ask you, raise these two questions, but I think they're sort of around common themes. So one is from Gregor Skirman, which is that a lot has happened in the CASA landscape since the late 20th century. Can you tell us a bit more about the history of CASA in terms of what it took to get to the 2011 treaty and what barriers had to be overcome? And then there's been another question that's, I think, pretty closely related, that from Kamwita Mutu, about what are the foundational transnational environmental policy frameworks that enable the CASA collaboration to function? Is it embedded entirely within the SADC mechanisms, or is it relying on other mechanisms? So, and I'm happy to repeat either of those. So,
thank you, Joe. And I think in terms of history, it goes back to the early 2000s, and there were initiatives to try and foster, by NGOs actually, to try and foster this initiative of CASA. I think it was called OZAC or something like that. And this initiative was kick-started, but didn't go very far because there was no government support. And until when the government started talking and basically working on the basis of a shared risk and a commitment to protecting transboundary resources, and also realizing the support of what the SADC treaty provides for in terms of regional integration in different aspects, including in terms of environment and economic development. And one thing I neglected to say is that actually CASA is a SADC initiative. So you have support at different levels, and not just at the intergovernmental level, but also at the community level. We do have structures which are known as Transboundary Natural Resources Management Forums that actually support the work of CASA. And so it's very clear here that we really need to look at CASA as an initiative that has benefited from a process of vertical integration, basically support at different levels. And associated with that, coming to the second question, there were a number of barriers, like I think that were encountered. Like I mentioned earlier, it was an initiative that was pushed mainly by NGOs and did not gain the traction that was needed as a result. But when there was a realization that a partnership was required from different sectors, the public, community, NGOs, and I haven't mentioned this, part of the funding that has been coming to CASA is actually through various local and international NGOs that have gone out of their way to fundraise in support of the CASA vision. And this is the partnership what has brought CASA to where it is today, where we are talking, for example, of a CASA-wide, an unprecedented initiative, the CASA-wide aerial survey, having undertaken detailed in-country and transboundary planning processes for the prioritization of challenges, issues, and key conservation development threats. So I hope I've responded to the question. Really SADC provides the regional framework, and the partner states have been working with the CASA treaty as the guiding document, which commits them to the shared vision. Thank you.
Great, and we had a question just for clarification for those of us. So the SADC is the South African Development Community, is that correct?
Southern Africa Development Communities. It's one of the regional economic bodies in Africa.
Okay, great, thank you. I think now we're going to turn to Alex for your question. So if you want to unmute yourself, Alex.
Yes, thank you very much, Joel. I think I'm enjoying this discussion. And actually my question goes to Dr. Nyambe, who is explaining things very clearly and very well. And specifically my question is about the CASA itself. CASA is a conservation area, and from the map, there is sort of a clear distinction between the CASA area and the non-CASA area. And my question is, do we have mechanisms that help the CASA landscape to be managed differently? You do not want a situation whereby a CASA and non-CASA areas are managed the same way, such that in the 50 years to come, when you come back to the same place, nobody will realize whether CASA was there or not. So I'm talking about things like guidelines, things like standards. Do you have such conservation tools? I can give an example of, for example, the infrastructure, the power infrastructure, for example. Do you have like standards that says this is how the power infrastructure, for example, should be deployed within the CASA region? And if we do not have such guidelines or standards, is there appetite, is there intention for such tools to be developed for CASA? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. As I mentioned earlier, CASA is a mosaic of land uses. So it's not a conservation area, it is a conservation and development area. Partner states are very clear on this. They do not want to restrict development, but they would like development that is sustainable on a sustainable pathways. And the points that you raise are very, very important. The partner states have committed to processes of ensuring harmonization of management policies, and also even legislation, so that there is better coordination across the landscape. Talking about standards, yes, we do have some standards, not everything. It's a process, but like I mentioned earlier, CASA is part of the Southern Africa Development Community. And so there are protocols and there are strategic plans that CASA has to abide by. So for example, right now, partner states through SADC have quite advanced in terms of preparing the law enforcement and anti-poaching strategy. CASA Secretariat is going to work with the partner states to actually ensure that they have an implementation plan. This is one of the issues that I think was raised earlier by Amanda in terms of one of the benefits of working in this way, which is to actually contribute to or being able to meet international obligations. Activities that are undertaken by other bodies within Southern Africa Development Community. In particular here, I would like to talk to the two river basin organizations that CASA works very closely with, the Okavango Watercourse Commission and the Zambezi Watercourse Commission. These are the mandated entities when it comes to the management of water resources in their respective areas. But the CASA Secretariat works with them very closely to ensure that there is a joint collaboration and planning and also management as appropriate of specific interventions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nyambe. Quick comment from Patty, just as a follow-up, agree with Amanda about the need for a strong umbrella body. The challenge is the differences in participating countries' legislation and environmental legal processes. If we want to comment on that a little bit later, we can, but I want to go to the next question. This one's from Larry, and it relates to what Amanda talked about and the importance of coordinating across organizations and projects in order to really benefit from everyone's work and share that risk. There seems to be it sounds like a really recent diversity of funding for CASA. And so the question is, to what degree is there coordination among the funders and efforts to realize co-benefits across the various projects that they all fund?
I guess that is again coming to me, but what I would just say is that that is a very valid observation, and we experience that in CASA. There are risks of duplication and fragmentation, and also on the part of some implementing partners, there's a risk of double dipping. I mean, these are realities. So I think one of the mechanisms we've done, also informed by our stakeholder engagement strategy, is actually establishing of what is known as the donor roundtable. We had the inaugural one last year, and we should be having another one very soon. But the whole idea is to get a sense of who's doing what and where, and begin to map this work. And we want to do this in a transparent manner so that everybody knows what is being invested. So we're trying to address those risks that come with lack of coordination. And the CASA Secretariat, as a coordination and facilitation hub, is responsible for ensuring that this is happening. And I think I just want to mention that if we haven't done it today, or maybe we did it already, we actually have a very cool map on our website that is showing the various investments and who is doing what in the different parts of CASA, courtesy of WWF that we've been working with, WWF Germany that we've been working with on this. If we don't have it, I think we should be posting that any day. But this is a big challenge for us, and a big challenge also for the donors. And I think the donor roundtable is one mechanism of addressing this challenge. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm curious about another question to explore, and this is really a question for everyone. So if people in the audience have some ideas, please raise your hand or unmute yourself, and you can turn on your webcam. But we talked a bit about, Amanda spoke specifically about the difficulty of engaging in a partnership with an organization when you're working with one or two people, and maybe their interest and engagement is not very high, or perhaps you have a great partnership, but then they leave the organization and it turns over. What techniques or examples or stories could anyone share, especially our panelists, about ways to overcome those challenges and maintain a more robust and long-term partnership with folks in individuals in an organization? So if people on the panel have ideas for stories, go ahead and speak up. And if individuals on the call want to chime in, please do. And if you don't have any immediate answers, you can think about it for a while and we'll move on to another question.
Yeah. Maybe, again, Melanie, just to say that is a real challenge, and it is expected. Turnover can cause disruptions, and it is really, one can say you can only simply do it by ensuring that everything is institutionalized, but personal relationships also have a role to play in this. So it's really about balancing institutionalization and ensuring that you are working with focal points, you have all the documentation that you need. And this is one of the reasons why, Professor Gandiwa, for example, spoke about, ZIMPACs as an example of an implementing agent or a coordinator for the country. We do not just send everything to everybody at random. We go through the desk office through ZIMPACs to reach to any other entity in Zimbabwe. It's very important that we have that focal point. We have the desk officer and we have the coordinating ministry and also ZIMPACs. And this is also the case across the other partner states. I wouldn't say that just institutionalizing is enough. You also need to have that personal relationship, quickly pick up a phone, send a WhatsApp message to follow up on something, send an email. So both the formal and the informal aspects are very important. But ultimately, we shouldn't just forget that we are human. We need to have the formal processes and the informal processes working together. Thank you.
I agree with that. And I just add to that, first off, that is 100% right, the institutional plus the personal relationships. And then if we can show value, I think the next piece of that is demonstrating value to those that are participating so that they can go back to, so the focal point can go back to their institution and say, this is why we participate, because it is providing the service where we are achieving these goals and objectives that we wouldn't have achieved otherwise. And sometimes that needs to start small and say, let's just get something done. Let's link action to impact, even in a small way, to demonstrate value. And then we can build as more and more people see the value of participating. And sometimes if you have an organization that might be just kind of sitting back and watching and to see, well, is this really worth my time and effort to engage? I'm going to just sit back and watch. If you can demonstrate the value of these partnerships and the on the ground impact, then that institution might say, okay, yeah, we're gonna come in because this is something that's important.
Perhaps just briefly from the Zimbabwean experience. So for ZIMPACs, we have what we call a TFCA unit, a Transfrontier Conservation area unit. So in that unit, which is specifically a section which is within ZIMPAX, which deals with the TFCA issues, and for CASA would then have the specific office dealing with CASA. And what that some of the strategies that we do have is that we have a national platform where we engage all the key stakeholders that are involved in wildlife, but also other developmental projects within the CASA landscape. And this helps us to ensure that there is that shared vision about what CASA is all about. More importantly, also about in the synergies in terms of conservation and rural development. We have seen this over the years that even if there's been some turnover in terms of staff moving, we still have that shared aspect about the Transboundary conservation area. And whoever comes, somewhat there is that track record, and also documents that are shared, minutes about what's happening here. And now and again, we do have some committee meetings specific to various aspects about the engagements at CASA. It could be conservation, community, financial issues, so that everyone is moving together, and not that only having a few people that are dedicated to CASA, but it's more about the stakeholder engagement, which is more broader beyond those that are working in conservation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that input. I want to ask another question. We've had a few questions specifically focused on climate change in our chats, and perhaps I'd like to start with you, Dr. Gandiwa, in these questions. And really it is, what are the key climate change risks and impacts that you see or anticipate seeing in Zimbabwe? And has the park, the TFCA in general, experienced the climate change impacts that you typically think of, which would be fires and floods in your area?
Thank you very much. Very key questions, very important questions indeed for conservation. So in terms of climate change, the key aspects to us is the frequency and the intensity of extreme events. And more importantly, if we look at CASA, because CASA is mostly semi-arid, so the main worrying aspect is to do with droughts. And over the years, we have seen an increase in terms of the occurrence of droughts. Just to indicate that for the biggest park in Zimbabwe, which is Hwange National Park, which contributes a significant in terms of a significant portion in terms of the elephant occupants and also residents. That park, in almost 90% of the park, is no natural river which is flowing across the park. So we rely mostly on underground water provision to the animals. So we are actually over the years we have been providing water through diesel pumping engines, so diesel engines that are and now we have moved to solar powered systems. So what we have seen is the issue of the groundwater recharge, which we are also worried about, so that we are able to continue providing in a sustainable way water provision to these wildlife, more importantly elephants, which are which have a high density in the park. But in terms of the other extreme fires, I've seen it has been, so most of the fires in savanna ecosystems, 1% are natural fires, 99% is mostly anthropogenic. So whenever we have wet seasons, the fuel load, the biomass increases, and we have a challenge where we have to manage fires in a very sustainable way. But more importantly, the key aspect to us is our droughts, where in a number of years, I'm sure you have also seen natural mortalities. Some have actually heard on the media or news that we have some elephants that have just died because of lack of water, and also more important, lack of forage. And those are very, very key important aspect. And this, as has been earlier indicated, that we share the population with other countries. So whenever there is drought, communities also you have dependence on natural resources. So those are some of the aspects that we are seeing now, that we see issues of dependence on the same water that we are providing for wildlife also being needed by communities. Similarly, communities would also need to do, both in Zimbabwe, we have sustainable utilization, where we also have issues of hunting. So in that regard, we also have dynamics where animals may die, but also the campfire program will also have lesser opportunities for people to do sustainable utilization. So these are the current dimension, but long term we are more worried about droughts, which would have a major implication on the biodiversity, and also for areas that have natural river systems. We have situations where we are afraid that we may also have reduction in river flows, which also have impact on aquatic ecosystems, but more importantly on the local communities that also rely on those for ecotourism purposes and also for recreational purposes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick follow-up, and the other folks can chime in. We're almost out of time, but I'm just wondering really quickly, do you have strategies in mind to adapt to the reality of groundwater recharge challenges and lack of surface water?
Yeah, Melanie, Professor Gandiwa has really put the context on climate in CASA very well. Allow me to just say that one of the key issues when it comes to climate change is the reality of the various river systems that we have that actually cut across international boundaries. So I mentioned earlier the importance of the two river basin organizations that are taking the lead in ensuring transboundary governance and management of these critical water resources. And they have systems and structures. They are the water experts. And of course, with the guidance of SADC. Now, a key issue that we are trying to do in CASA is noting the challenges that Professor Gandiwa has mentioned, is that we are trying to understand the situation with regards to groundwater. And we've started with the support of USAID through IMI. We've done a transboundary diagnostic assessment for that part, and also undertaken water quality studies and working with other partners such as National Geographic through the World Bed Trust, who are doing surveys across different rivers like the Lungwebungo, the Okavango, and these studies are all going to feed into informing us as CASA Secretariat and also as SADC, and of course through the river basin organizations in terms of streamlining our plans. It's also very important to mention that the key concerns around climate actually exacerbates problems around pollution, a human-wildlife conflict, and access to certain areas in terms of mobility of people. But very important also is that the natural flooding and natural flooding regime of the certain rivers in CASA is actually part of the system that enables the wildlife to persist in the wild. Through this rhythm, you have environmental flows, you have hydrological connectivity, and very importantly also the need to protect critical freshwater recharge areas. And all these things add up into helping to protect the landscape in terms of biodiversity and people from the deadly impacts of climate change. And we need to understand the impacts that climate also has on specific species. Imagine the survival of elephants with drought. I would just pause there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. We are out of time, but I really want to continue this conversation, and we can do so in the next several sessions of this series, the next of which is September 28th. Everyone on this call will receive a follow-up email with a link to register for that session. And if you have ideas about conversations you would like to feature or speakers you would like to join on this session at the last Wednesday of every month for the rest of the year, please respond to my email and give us your suggestions. We'd really like to make this a platform for everyone to share their perspectives and experiences. And I really want to give a huge thank you to our panelists for coming today and for sharing, for everyone for this wonderful conversation we've had on chat and your great questions. So we will talk to you by email later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you.